I shared some testimony about what I'm going through on a recent video called Breaking to Build, and Nelissa asked a question about how we hear God's instruction when we're rending our hearts. And I think that's a really good question to cover in a video, so that's what I'm going to do here. So part of what she said is when there's so much noise around you, like how do you do this? How do you rend your heart and hear God's instruction when there's so much noise around you, and even in the stillness there is so much noise? So I think that what I'm hearing, because if there's stillness around and there's noise, then that noise is coming from inside of us. And if there's noise around us and there's noise inside, that noise is coming from us. So I think that there are some different questions that are built into this question, and I want to address this one first. God's spirit is a spirit of peace. And so the peace is going to come from us. Even in the word it says, like when you look at the land, there's only darkness. But you, depending on whether you're his people or you're not, you are going to be feeling peace. You are going to be, drinking in abundance. And that's because your state is always contingent on the spirit that is in you. When I was in the world and I was very, very wealthy, I had a lot of what the world would call security. I was never going to have to worry about money again. I was never going to have to be concerned about that. But I never felt secure. I really never felt like I was going to be taken care of. And that's because of the spirit that was occupying me. I had a spirit of fear, which comes from the enemy. So you can be in a situation that is dire and actually feel peace. And I am in a situation that is dire right now. I shared about that in that video. I will tell you right now that I don't feel peace all the time, because also what God requires us to do is to really be fanning into that spirit. So you can have the spirit of God, but if you don't fan into it, eventually that spirit is going to leave. And so before I go to bed every night, I've got to do this work. I have to remind myself of who God is, what he's done, what he's promised, all of the things that, the experiences that I've had with him along the way, and all of the times that I went to him. I mean, the decisions that I've made, I didn't make decisions based on like what I wanted to do. I made decisions based on what I didn't want to do, and he was telling me to do. So in order to do that, a fool would just say, oh, okay, I'm going to go do this. But I sat with him and I made sure that what I believed that I was hearing was correct. And then I asked for the two witnesses by his spirit and his word. So show me in the word how this is congruent with what you require. And because I know I did that along the way, and I slowed down and I didn't make impulsive and compulsive decisions without sorting these things through, now when I'm in this dire situation and I'm up against that, the sea with the Egyptian chariots chasing me, I'm able to stop and say, okay, let's look at this. Is there anything that I did that I took for myself? Is there anything that I did that was not in line with God, that I did not sort through with him? And I can confidently tell you right now, there is nothing. There is nothing, not one decision that I made that I did not sit with God and make sure that I was hearing correctly. So although this is hard and God has required me to do things that don't make sense in terms of the world. They don't make financial sense or security sense. When God tells you to do something, you do it, but you also make sure that you're hearing from him. So even though there's chaos all around me, as I return to God's spirit every day, multiple times a day, as I'm fanning into flame, as I'm going through this very difficult trial of testing of my faith and purification of my heart, I am able to get still. I am able to feel his peace, his confirmation, his assurance, but it is something that I have to work for. I have to put in the work to do my part in the covenant, to remind myself and stand in faith. There are times when this is easier. It is not easy right now, I will tell you that. I can tell you right now, it is not easy with the things that I'm going through. Now, I want to talk about this topic of rending your heart. In Joel 2:12 and 2:13, it says, "Even now declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. Rend your heart and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love, and he relents from sending calamity." This concept of rending is understood to be like early on in the Bible, God established that when someone was in mourning or grief, that they would rend their clothes. And what they would do is they would tear their clothes. And so you saw this also in the New Testament. You saw that when the I think it was in Derbe, where the people were trying to worship, Lystra and Derbe, I think, where they were trying to worship Barnabas and Paul, and they said, no, we're just men, and they tore their clothes. That is an expression of grief and mourning. So they were in grief that these people were trying to worship them. And what God says is here, this is a new concept that he's introducing, that is, he's already established this concept that you tear your clothes as an expression of grief. Now he's saying, don't tear your clothes, tear your heart. Return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. Rend your heart and not your garments. And again, return. So he keeps using that language. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love, and he relents from sending calamity. Then Paul talks about a grief that is called godly grief. So grief has been well established in the Bible as something that is really important. And it's during grief. And if you think about the times that you've been grieving, that you have lost someone or something like that, everything just becomes like right-sized. Like you become small and humble, and you're able to stand before God in the correct posture that you need to be in, really. And you realize, my goodness, I don't have control over anything. Things could change in a second. And it's a really important place to be. God has established grief as something that is very important. And I feel like people just treat this as like, in a worldly way of like, that's just Jewish culture. No, God established the culture that is expressed in the Bible, not what is being exercised now or lived out now. That's been tainted and distorted by Reformed Judaism and rabbinical commentary and man making, trying to get glory for themselves. But what God established in the Bible is actually how we're supposed to be. We're supposed to regard grief as very important. And so if you think about the times that you've experienced grief, you returned to God because you realized you needed him. And so grief is important. And God says in Lamentations 3:33, I don't give grief willingly, but he does give it. And because he knows that it's necessary. I mean, we have to be in a position of grief. When we're not in a position of grief, we forget who we are before God and who he is before us. But when we are put into a position of grief, we're able to see things that we weren't able to before. And so Paul talks about godly grief, and he says that godly grief leads you to repentance. And here in Joel chapter 2, God is saying, return to me, and return to me with fasting and weeping and mourning, and do this with all your heart. And why does he say return to me so many times in the Bible? Because we're always straying from him. The flesh is always pulling us away from him. Remember that the flesh is weak. The flesh fights against the Spirit of God, but the Spirit is willing. So the Spirit that God placed in us, I'm not talking about the Holy Spirit, I'm talking about the Spirit that he placed in us. That Spirit is willing. Why do I know that he's talking about that? Because the disciples had not received the Holy Spirit when Jesus said the Spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. They hadn't received the Holy Spirit yet. Jesus had to be glorified. And when he said that, they were in the Garden of Gethsemane before Jesus died. So God has told us that when he makes us a new creation, he's going to remove our heart of stone, place in us a heart of flesh, a softened heart, and a new spirit. He's going to place his spirit in our heart. And that spirit, his spirit, is going to communicate with our spirit, because God is spirit. And he's going to be cleaning us up in our hearts. And this is our new covenant. This is the covenant that we have with him. It's not a list of external rules. This is something that is written on our hearts and minds. This has always been the will and the desire of God. And then we're told that we're going to be justified by our hearts on the day of the Lord. And that what is coming from our hearts, if indeed God is in our hearts, that is going to come out as fruit in our right hand and our forehead. Our deeds, the way we speak, what we believe, what we think. It's going to come out there. So all of the work that we need to be doing needs to be done in our heart. And very literally, what God is saying is, return to me. So turn to me and tear your heart. Get down to a deep place in your heart. Cleanse your heart. Be purified, made spotless, and refined. And something else that I think about as well with regard to like working out, you're tearing the muscle and then it's strengthening, and then you tear it and it strengthens, and your heart also is a muscle. So I think about that as well. Okay, so there are many metaphors that we can understand from this metaphor that God is using. If you tear your heart before him, it's going to be strengthened, isn't it? Because really the way for us to be strengthened spiritually is really to be torn down, to be broken down. And, it just so happens that was the title of that video, was Breaking to Build. God has to break us down in order to build us. We have to become like a child. We have to become humble in order to become strong. We have to become fools in order to become wise. One of the things that God said to me when he first drew me to himself was, you're about to unlearn everything you think you know. I didn't realize it at the time, but he was telling me I was a fool. He was letting me know that all that wisdom that I thought I had was absolute foolishness in his eyes. And he was about to break it all down. So let's go back to this question. How can you hear God's instruction when you're rending your heart, when you're tearing your heart? I'm going to tell you right now that that's the only way you can hear God's instruction. The heart is not, the pain and grief and suffering, that's not what keeps you from hearing God's voice. It's our flesh. Our flesh, living in your flesh, is what keeps you from hearing God's instruction. If you're living in the heart and spirit, then you're going to hear him. And if you're returning to him, you're going to hear him. It's when we're going through suffering and we decide to try to control things by the work of our hands, and we go into our flesh and we try to think it through and all of this other stuff instead of returning to God. There have been so many things so many to-do items like paying bills and things like that. When I get those bills, I never thought that I would ever be in this position again where I would get a bill and have to put it in a drawer. I used to pay my bills right away, schedule them right away. And so now it's bringing up, all of the, you haven't done anything yet. Are you going to do something? Do I pay this, or do I save for grocery, put this on a credit card and, save for groceries? What am I doing right now? It brings up all of that. And I can't go and start checking off boxes right now. I know better than that. I know better than that in my covenant, that I cannot go and start trying to just do, I could go to this mentality of thinking, well, this is something that I can at least check off and then I'll go return to God. But I know better than that. I don't make decisions until I go to God and feel his peace and his confirmation and his guidance. And actually, it's really important that I'm doing that right now, because I need a lot of guidance in what I'm going through, because this is unprecedented. I don't know anyone who's been through this. I don't know anyone who gave up their 3 businesses, their entire career, while they had 2 mortgages, because God told them this is not of me. What I know is that the Bible says it's hard for a rich man to be saved. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to be saved. And I take that very seriously. And the instruction that Jesus gave to that rich man was, go sell everything that you have and give to the poor. Well, I have given him everything, right down to the last bit of what I would have had in order to save my home. And that's where I'm at. So I have to go to God because I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I need his instruction. I need his direction. And I also need to know that I went to God and placed him first, because when I'm not seeing what he's doing, when I'm not seeing his plan, the one thing that I will have is that I can rely back on, but I didn't make any decisions on my own. I went to you, and I know that I made all of these decisions with you. If I have that, I can stand in my faith. If I don't have that, I'm going to feel fear. And why am I going to feel fear? Because I chose, by the work of my own hands, I chose self-idolatry, and so that's the spirit I'll be handed over to. But if I choose God, if I choose to go to him with every decision I've got to make, then I will be able to confidently stand, even though I'm being very honest. I have lots of moments of concern and worry and wondering, like, what have I done? And then I have to go through it again in my heart. Okay, is there anything that I didn't do? Now, how can I explain that God did this, this, and this? What is God's pattern in the Bible? What has he promised me? What is he promised in his word? And if I know that that my conscience is clear in the sight of God, I will be able to stand. And I'm telling you right now, that is the only reason I am able to stand. So yes, there's a lot of noise. There are phone calls, emails, text messages coming in. These people, these sharks are contacting my neighbors, my daughter. There's humiliation that I'm feeling over this. There is so much noise, so much external noise, but I'm able to get still and quiet inside. There's also internal noise. There are also concerns, as I'm sharing with you. But when I return, but that is an indication that I have to return to God. And I cannot, and I tell you guys this all the time, you need to recognize when you're in fear. You need to recognize when you are feeling compulsion. You need to recognize when you think that you have to act right now. There's urgency. In those moments, you got to stop yourself, and you have to recognize that that is not the Spirit of God. He does not compel you. He does not do things in urgency like that. He is a God of prudence and of peace, sound mind, self-control, and love. He's not going to jack you up the way that the devil does and makes you think, oh, you got to pay those bills right now or you're going to blah, blah, blah. No, that's not the Spirit of God. God is never going to put you in a position where you need to do something right now and place that thing and the work of your own hands before him. He will never, ever do that. And I know this because I know that he wants us to be single-minded, and he doesn't want us placing idols before him. He is not going to trick us for putting him first. Do you think God is going to trick me for giving up every single thing, lifting that up to him, every single thing that I have owned, that I worked so hard for? It's not like I just stepped over from, like, being in a bad situation to this. I gave up extreme wealth and status in the world. I gave up a doctorate that I not only worked 10 years for, and a career and contracts that I worked many years for. While I was getting that doctorate, I gave up time with my daughter. How do you think that feels? That the world told me this is what responsibility is. This is what you're giving your daughter such a gift by going to school and blah, blah, blah. Baloney. I'm telling you, baloney at the end of all of this. First of all, I went into a field that I didn't realize was completely against God. Second of all, my daughter doesn't care what's in my wallet or my bank account. She wanted her mom. And that is what God established, is for us to be with our babies raising them and spending time with them and teaching them through example who they must be. You think she cares? I mean, yes, she was proud of me and all these other things, but now that both of us are in Christ and I gave up my doctorate and she gave up her doctorate, we lost all that time together. It was pointless to be apart from my daughter, except that God knew what he was doing. He knew what he was teaching us. And because she knew what it was like to miss her mom while I was killing myself out there in the world, working and going to school full time, because she knows what it's like to be the child of someone who did that, she was willing to give up her career when she had her son to do the right thing, to do the thing that God established that a mother should be doing. She's home with her child. She gave up all of the wealth that she could have had, all of the status and the prestige, the attitudes and opinions that she has to hear from family members and friends and old colleagues, to do the right thing, to do the thing that she will never have to regret. And again, because she rent her heart before God, to God, and made that decision with him, she's never going to regret. She's not going to be put to shame. She's not going to have to feel satanic fear that comes from the spirit of fear, because she didn't hand herself over to that. She listened when he called. She obeyed when he called, and she can stand firm in her faith that God will take care of me because he has to, because I gave him what he asked for, because I made this decision with him. So not only when you remind yourself of that and you're able to live knowing that your conscience is clear before God, not only do you have his spirit of peace and his affirmation and his confirmation, but you can live with the assurance of the promises of blessing that God has. Now, I'm not talking about blessing according to counterfeit Christianity, because there seems to be a definition around blessing in counterfeit Christianity that is a very worldly definition. Like, the more you have, the more things you have in the world, the more blessed you are. I don't think so, guys. We're not talking about God establishing you in material wealth. We're talking about God is going to take care of your needs. He knows what you need. You don't have to really tell him what you need, because he knows better than you. And you're going to have peace. And you won't be put to shame. And you will be saved. Now, being this low and being in a position of testing, which I know that I'm being tested right now, because I recognize it. I recognize what it is to be pushed to the limits and having, even having the enemy up the ante, which God is sending. Don't think for a second that Satan, he's like throwing Satan a bone and being like, oh, go ahead and, torment her. I know that when these people are calling and I'm getting a phone call from my neighbor saying, hey, I got a couple of these phone calls, and now now I have to sort through the humiliation of my neighbors, my community knowing what's going on. I know that that is not something that God is just allowing Satan to torment me. He's sending it. He's sending it just like he sent it with Job. Just like he said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? And why? Because God has a plan in this. And what he's doing is seeing, are you going to try to take this up by the work of your own hands? Are you going to go back to the things that I brought you out of? The career, or the discipline, because obviously there's no career to go back to. Are you going to go do that? Are you going to start contemplating doing that? Because believe me, what you do in your heart, what you're thinking, oh, well, I have this as a backup plan. If you really believe that, it's the same thing as doing it. You've already worked it out in your heart. You're not going to be saved by what you physically do. You're going to be saved by what's going on in your heart. That's why Jesus talked that way and said, if you've lusted after a woman, you've already committed adultery in your heart. If you hate your brother or sister, you've already committed murder in your heart. So he's testing me. And one of the things that I had to do was sort out, okay, what is God doing right now in letting my neighbor find out that I'm in foreclosure? What is he doing with me? And what is he doing through me? If he allowed her to have that information, is there something that he's doing with me that, for example, has to do with like saving face or something like that? Am I going to be more concerned about how I look? Am I going to feel like I owe her an explanation? Because I don't owe anyone an explanation, and no one's going to understand or respect the decisions that I've made or my process with God. I'm not going to leave myself vulnerable to people who are not in Him, even claiming that they are, because this person claims to be a Christian. They're not going to understand the decisions I've made. People are going to think they're irresponsible. Ultimately, what I ended up doing was letting her know, look, I gave up my career because God let me know that it was not of Him. And I knew that what I was doing and risking when I gave up my career, and whatever is due to me is in God's hands, because she wanted to know how I was doing. I'm not going to leave myself vulnerable to telling someone all of the feelings that I have. They're not on the same faith journey. But I was willing to be used as an offering to let her know this is what I've done, so that when God does something, she will remember that I stood in faith in an impossible situation. And whether or not she returns to God or gives glory to Him is entirely between her and God. But I've done my part to be used. I had to pause for a minute because I was trying to remember, why did I bring this up? The reason I brought this up is because there are moments right now where I'm not hearing from God, and it's not because He's not near. It's because He is purifying me, and He's requiring me to stand and to remember who He is and what He's done, because this is how you prove your faith. This is faith. Faith is not talking about it after the fact and being like, oh, look what God did. Faith is walking through this right now. When things are hopeless, when things are impossible, right now is the faith. It's hope in things that are not seen. That means it hasn't happened yet. It's easy for people to tell you about their faith after the fact. It's easy for them to give glory after they've already received the thing. But I want to know, how did you walk through that? That is what's going to tell me whether or not you really walk through that in faith, whether or not you actually had faith. And this is the reason why I believe it's been so important for me to share with you, even though it's very uncomfortable, how I'm walking through this. Now, I hear God, but I don't hear Him about the things I want to hear about. I want to know, what are you doing? What's going to happen? And I receive confirmation here and there about this situation. He's not telling me ahead of time what He's going to do. And as a matter of fact, if you have been tested in different situations, then you probably remember that one of the things that God does is He will cause you to imagine different scenarios. He's going to test you to see, like, where are you going to tear your heart to? Where are you going to, it kind of reminds me of like when you cut a rose bush. The cut should be facing where you want to send the rose bush, like where you want, in the direction that you want to grow it. And in a way, that's what we're doing with our heart. We're tearing it in the direction that we want to send it. So one of the things that God has tested me on is reminding me where He says in the scriptures that those who give up fields and houses for His sake will receive 100 times as much in this age and in the age to come. And so then I think, well, is He going to require me to do that? Because I've already left a field. For sure, I've left a field, and I've been willing to leave a house, but I took this up with Him. You want me to stay here? Do you want me to sell and then rent? Do you want me, what is it that you want me to do? And so I don't know what He's going to do. I know that, and also, I was talking with my daughter about this today, is that you have to leave room for God to turn you in the way that He's going to turn you. Even though God told me, I set you up here. And when I asked Him, do you want me to sell and go somewhere else? Which was actually what I wanted to do. He told me, you stay in the place that you were in when I called you. This is the place I set you up. He told me years ago when I was considering renting out the front unit that place was for my family. So I remember all of these things, and I've understood this is where I'm supposed to stay, and He has not told me to leave. But what He's doing is testing my heart, because He could have had me stay here for a given amount of time. God doesn't tell you ahead of time what He's going to do. He moves you as you go. So he could move me at any point and say, okay, it's time now for you to leave. This is how long I wanted you to stay here. Okay, then that's what you do. So there are multiple layers to me standing in faith. It's like, okay, well, your word does say this, and so I'm willing to do that. But I'm also going to need to understand and need to reconcile the fact that I asked you so many times about this to make sure that I was doing the right thing by staying here and not selling or downsizing or whatever. I'm going to need you to reconcile that. And also, I will obey you no matter what. I will believe in you no matter what. I will trust you no matter what. That's not an easy thing to do, guys. I hope my offering is not being wasted on superficially listening to what I'm saying, because this is something that you're going to need to understand in your covenant. And if you are not willing to take the time to try to understand what I'm going through, what the apostles went through, what Jesus went through, what the prophets went through, well, then you're going to have to understand it by going through some more things yourself. So I highly recommend that you sit and really take in what I'm talking about. We have been told that we are going to be baptized by water and by fire. And being baptized by fire, God uses this metaphor of being purified, made spotless, and refined. And he talks about gold being purified. And the process of making gold is to melt the gold, put it through the fire, and separate the impurities from the pure gold. There are so many things that God is going to test your heart on, but you're going to need to be attuned to him in order to listen to what he's causing you to consider, because it's either him bringing things up in your thoughts and your imaginations and wondering about and bringing up scripture, and then you've got to rend your heart to that possibility. Or if you choose to reject his ministry, if you choose not to listen, if you choose to be desensitized, if you choose to just repress all of the feelings and thoughts that come up that he's raising inside of you, and you choose not to deal with that, well, he's going to have to find another way to make you sort these things out in your heart. And maybe what he will have to do, since you ignored it, is actually put you through some of those situations. So I've told you before that you can greatly reduce the grief that God has to bring on you by just listening to him, by learning how to emotionally sort through the things that he is raising in your heart. And that way, you've done your personal accountability work to bring yourself into that position so that God doesn't have to bring you there. Because if he has to bring you into that position and because you've not been willing to do it, it's not going to be good. It's going to be a lot harder. I've had this experience many, many times with people that I've worked with, where I've given the workshops for free, the books for free, the phone calls, the text messages, the availability to be a personal shepherd. Do you know how much money I made in the world as a psychologist? Not even teaching the truth. I thought it was the truth at the time. So it's not as though I set out to deceive, but now I'm giving you my time, not even for free. It's at my cost. I'm the one paying for it. And people could take it or leave it. And more often leave it when it's inconvenient to live out this covenant. And so, God talks about these things. He says, I tried to cleanse you, but you would not be clean. Therefore, my wrath against you will not be clean again until my wrath against you has subsided. And in that situation, he's talking with those who are eventually actually going to be saved. But to walk away from what God has given you in his servants is it's just such a foolish decision to not do the work, or to spit on the offering, or to not receive the rebuke, or to engage superficially, or check off boxes and treat it with disdain. And then in the book of Isaiah, he says, because you rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloah and rejoice over Rezin and the son of Remaliah. So you're rejoicing over evil. Therefore, the Lord is about to bring against them the mighty floodwaters of the Euphrates, the king of Assyria with all his pomp. Now, this is a group who's not going to be saved. So he talks about this over and over in the word. If you reject truth, you reject knowledge, it's not because it wasn't made available to you. It most certainly has been made available to you in his spirit, his word, and his servants. If you reject that knowledge, if you pursue falsehood, you will perish. He gives opportunities. He has built into your design the necessity to return to him. He has built into your design feelings, grief, emotional experiences that should lead you to return to him, that you should be listening to. But so often what we do is we don't want to be bothered by those feelings, and the world supports that. We don't want to be bothered by the feelings, especially the ones we think are negative, which are actually some of the most important feelings: grief, sadness, anger. You just need to understand that this is the design that God has given you so that you know how to use that design and return to him. And then he's going to build you, and he's going to test you, and he's going to break you, and he's going to crush you, because he knows what's best. He knows what's required in this covenant. All of that to say that when you're rending your heart to God, you may not hear him in the way that you want to. You may not hear the answers you want to hear during periods of testing, and you need to be able to discern those periods of testing. So if you're not hearing from him, either you've not gone deep enough in your work, your personal accountability work. So that should be the first question. I mean, the first thing that you do, okay, I need to do a fast. I need to circumcise from the sinful flesh, discipline the physical flesh, and get into the heart and spirit. I need to listen for what God is bringing up inside of me, and you will hear from him. But if you're not hearing the things that you want to hear, then you know that this is a time of testing. If you're seeing things ramp up, like I've been explaining, Satan is being given power to ramp things up because God is using that to test you. Well, then you just got to get into position to be tested. Then you just have to understand that you have to pass this test, and that when you learn the lesson, he will relent. He has told me that so many times since the very beginning, because I used to ask him all the time when he was healing my body. I would say, when is this going to go away? Tell me when. And he would tell me, I don't work on those timelines. When you learn the lesson, the sooner you learn the lesson, the sooner I will relent. And I'm telling you, he did it every time. But you need a way to do that. You need a way to be able to lean in and understand what God is raising in you. Lean into your physical sensations, your memories, your emotions, your dreams, whatever it is that he's bringing up. You need a way to lean in. That is what I offer you in those books. They are free. This is not an infomercial. This is not a marketing ploy. The books are available to you on the homepage of this channel. They are in PDF. One is a workbook. One is a text talking about the times and talking about, healing, and how healing is synonymous with salvation in the Bible, how God designed us to heal for the end game of salvation, and how that has been interfered with and rewritten in the world. So that in the world, when you want to heal, you go to a field that they call science that fundamentally denies that there's a creator. And you do this whether you have emotional sickness, mental illness, physical illness, which are all spiritual. They all require a spiritual remedy, which is return to God. And he established in our covenant that he is the Lord who heals us. But this generation says God gave us science. So I discuss that and many other things in A Soul Aligned. But in Heart Owned Series, that's the workbook. That's the practical application to teach you how to engage in personal accountability so that you can heal and be healed and bring yourself correctly to God. Please discern this message with God.